Okay, hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the RoundTable Podcast. Today we will be talking about the blackatbreck Instagram account that has grown very rapidly in the past week or two. So welcome back. My name is John Fullerton.
I'm Roberta.
Dylan.
Derek.
I'm Eloise. I graduated in 2019 and I just finished my freshman year at Pomona.
Yes, I forgot to add, we are very, very grateful to welcome Eloise Cherry to the table today. We've had class with her. She's an awesome discussant, and we thought she'd have a good perspective to share on the topic. So I guess we could start this episode by asking, what were you guys' first thoughts when you saw how fast the account grew and just kind of the community's reaction to it?
For me personally, I saw the account. I think what started the account was first a response by a Breck alum to Breck's post on Juneteenth. I think it was on Facebook. And I saw a screenshot of it and it was sent in the group chat. And this alum was just going in on Breck and like her experience and how it wasn't a good experience with teachers that she had. And it was really, it was discrediting Breck's ability to celebrate Juneteenth for their lack of reconciliation to their education about, especially to Black history and teaching Black culture and how to maintain that in their space while they boast diversity, but their inability to connect to students in a space where they feel safe. And I think that's what really sparked it, in my opinion. And then after that, just more screenshots were sent, and then I had to go check it out myself.
Yeah, for me, I think it was cool to see because like this is a really, for one, efficient way to like get voices out there, because everyone's on Instagram and like one post can reach a lot of people in that way. So I think it's efficient for one, but it's also very public, number two. And I think that's important because it sends a message to Breck that can't really be ignored in the same way that like one email to one administrator can be, you know what I mean? And so I think those two things made it a cool and interesting thing for me to see. But then actually reading through them, it made it a lot more real because I could actually like relate to what people were talking about. So for me, it was really interesting.
The account followed me pretty early into it starting, and I was really excited to see a platform that was open, and I wasn't sure really what it was going to become. And then in a matter of days, it kind of blew up. And I think for me, seeing and reading the stories, it was one, seeing the wide vast, like you had alumni, you had current students, you had people talking about their high school experience, their experience in preschool. And I think also just having the similarities tied together on one platform that everyone could read through, and it's just overwhelming the kind of same process that a lot of people had just gone through at their experience at Breck.
Yeah, I echo what y'all said. It was really good, I think, to see and to be created. And like just like you said, reading through the raw experiences that people have had. And it's like if you read through them all at once, you see, like Weezy said, you see so many connections and there's so much repetition. And that's like, and it's really like, I don't know, to me, like, while the account is really cool, it's kind of saddening that something like this has to be made because it's clear that the reconciliation for all these actions, for all these experiences has never been like the school has never took the time to address them. And that's what happens. You get this repression, like there's a common theme like throughout the majority of posts where it's like, this is bringing back so many memories, so much shit I like push back out of my memory. And like, that's like, it's sad that has to happen in order for it to be like obvious or for people to reconcile.
Yeah, I think like for me, there was like a level of like shock to it because like as somebody who just graduated from that institution, you know, I had spent like the last like month trying to remember like all the good memories and stuff and like, you know, going through graduation and, you know, all the time I spent with my friends, but then seeing that and like all the pain that's kind of been like not really like public and like not very open. That was like, it was really hard for me to see an institution that like I've really appreciated my last 13 years at, but still has like these major issues. But I think it also is like a sign of relief. Like I forget who said it, but it's really hard to ignore this when it's public, and there will be prospective parents and prospective donors, you know, like that's things that like the institute, that like the administration like pays attention to. And so I think like having this public will hopefully like create some like major change. And I think another thing that increased like the level of shock was seeing the alumni from like 20 years ago, from the graduating class from like 20 years ago in like '02 and like 2000, like that to me showed like a trend, along with the themes that Wheezy talked about, where you could see, you know, between different students sharing their stories, the similar themes and like the issues that they had been facing over like such a long period of time. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was just like the shock, and then also kind of like it was like uncomfortable reading those stories for me, because like it was an institution that like, again, I've really enjoyed, but then seeing like that other side to it that I, you know, wasn't always apparent to me, made me uncomfortable, but it still felt good reading like all of them and stuff.
We talked about themes, and I think that's really important. One of the themes I saw is like, it's kind of two paths like a post can go down. It's like something that another student may have done to someone, or like more on the administrative side. And one of the questions me and Roberto were talking about, this stuff, was like, who's not to blame, but like, where should the reforms start from? Like the student body, the people, the kids, or more on the administrative, like the weight on their shoulders? What do you guys think about that?
I personally think it starts with the administrators, because I think in an institution like a school, if you don't have mentors or people in positions of power that you feel are looking out for you, or people you can go to, a lot of the stories that I felt were the most disheartening were like students going to teachers and just being brushed aside, or, you know, being like having their experience just not validated, and then nothing coming from it. And I think if you don't have that, what do you have? And a lot of these things, it's like the students need to hear that their teachers and these people in positions of powers are looking out for them and care about them. And I think Breck is not doing that, which is clear from the stories.
I think
Also,
another thing, or
ahead,
Roberto, you go ahead.
You got it.
Like, I think another thing was like seeing how a lot of these stories kind of originated from people, you know, where it happened in lower school. And so I think for me, the reform should start with, hopefully with Breck addressing this the way Dr. Hernandez did, but hopefully more open in ways like MLK Day, but obviously much more consistent and more part of like the curriculum, I think. But I think it does start with the administrators, because I think all the students coming in will be kind of growing up in their own households with different policies and beliefs and views. And I think you'll have these young kids coming, because a lot of the stories were like these, like, you know, POC students at Breck kind of being harassed by like white students in like lower school. And I think it's really hard for administrators to kind of like change the minds of the lower schoolers. It's really, I think, like the parents' responsibility at that point. But I think if you can get the administrators to kind of like work it into the curriculum from a young age, hopefully by like middle or upper school, if students are coming from households where there's as much dialogue or awareness, or, you know, where there could be like blatant racism, I think like then hopefully that can start a dialogue and kind of like subvert that a little bit as students get older and are kind of molded by the institution.
Yeah, I also agree, like the administration, even though it's definitely on student body, I also feel like there's an added responsibility you have as an administrator, especially when like it's a school. These are kids, you know? And like, I'm not going to go as far as to say like kids can't make mistakes, because they do. But when you let those state mistakes go by like unaddressed and unpunished, it creates this kind of like this vortex where, you know, anything happens. It like reminds me, it's called like the broken windows theory. It's like a crime theory that kind of states that if there are like broken windows in a community, and there's just a lot of like little crimes like graffiti things like that, it causes kind of snowball effect where it seems like in that environment, crime is encouraged. Like you need to clean up the little stuff or it's going to lead to the big stuff. And so it's like on the administrators to do that too, because that was one of my biggest issues going through Breck as a high schooler, is like, as I became slowly more aware of stuff, it like, I don't know, it was kind of disturbing because there's like a large part of me that wrestled with the fact that like, as I'm becoming more aware, it's like, was this always present and I just didn't see it? Or is this a new thing? And like the thing that this account highlights is none of this is new, you know? This is a constant pattern. And yet it's not something you hear about. And that's like, when it comes to administration, you guys all know they sweep so much stuff under the rug, so much stuff. And it's like, it's crazy because I was thinking about it earlier today, like in preparation of this episode. I was trying to think like why, and like, I don't know, like an idea that kind of came to me is like, students, like when the students do something wrong and like the administration doesn't like outright say it, I feel like they're kind of distancing themselves away from it because they feel like if they do address it, part of the responsibility is going to be on them. Like those students' actions is partially on them. And so like, in order to just avoid that, they like instead like deal with it, like away from everything. Like an example was, Mr. Taylor's town hall speech last year after a certain individual called Mr. Slack the N-word. Instead of outright addressing the situation, he said racism will not be tolerated. You know, that doesn't help the situation. You know what I mean? And as an administrator, it's his job to point out what happened and to address it. And only then are we going to be able to move on. By not by not addressing it at all, like actually addressing it head on, it creates like this environment where people can get away with stuff and they know it's just going to get swept under the rug. So yeah, it's a lot, but
I'd say
some good points.
Yeah, thank you, Rose, for getting to that point and also that philosophical analogy. I think for me, there's a story that comes to my mind. I play over and over. I've been this kind of person, but Mr. Taylor's dissertation for his doctorate kind of brought up this point for me. And it happened in lower school the most. I feel like that's like the most crucial time for like the development of young African-American boys and like the system of education that they're going through. And for me, the problem started in second grade, but like it hit like this peak in fourth grade where I had a teacher that like I just couldn't connect with. Like academically I was doing fine, but like behaviorally, like she wanted to like nitpick on all the things that I was doing, and I couldn't explain why I felt like I wasn't in the wrong and why I felt like she was just consistently picking on me. And I think it came to like this peak when in I think sophomore year, like after going through like I wouldn't say it was emotionally scarring, but it was just draining as a fourth grader to like have this teacher that felt like if I was budging in line or if I like made a joke in class that wasn't disrupted, it would disrupted the class, but not to the level where I felt like it was or something that I should have been like sent to the office for, and then like that was where I spent the rest of my day in the morning. And I think little moments like that then carried into high school, still being a part of like this institution. And coming into high school, when I finally like there's a moment where I can like put my finger on it, where a student uses the N-word within our friend group, within our social friend group, in a way that I would typically react in fourth grade saying like, yo, that's not cool. Now to like I'm stopping and thinking about how do I address this? Like I feel like I can't even, it goes back to like this your broken window theory, where now that I'm in this situation where all these little things that like I knew were wrong, when it comes to like this big thing, I don't know how to address it and I don't know who to talk to. And I think this is something fairly common that was said within the Black at Breck post, was now students think that they have the N-word pass. that's not a thing. And it's something that is like this trend, like once you like start listening to like more hip hop music and once that like starts becoming like the party vibe. But like getting the passion friend is still bringing up this historical trauma that as a school that hasn't even addressed. And that is something that I think that's just like a story that I put like to put that into context. Like, starting off small, but then when it gets to a big thing, when you need to react, then you're like, okay, well, who do I turn to? Like, I know historically that the school struggles with giving support to students who need it the most in a time of need, and especially with racial incidents. And that's just my story.
I think like another profound thing that I've kind of like taken from the anonymous submissions was the kind of feeling of like loneliness, like not a loneliness, but like the feeling of being on your own as like a lower schooler or middle schooler and not really having support or anyone you can talk to. That was like that really like stuck with me. Dylan, you asked about themes, and that kind of seemed like something like students not really knowing where they can go with this and feeling like they were kind of like isolated at this institution with their problems. And I'm curious if you guys like, I think like that could be helped with having more kind of like mentor and like teachers who reflect the diversity of the student body and have that diversity reflected in the faculty. But other than that, do you guys like, what do you guys think like Breck's immediate and long-term kind of like response to this Black at Breck kind of movement, I guess would be a way, or not even a movement, but kind of like this awakening maybe of this platform and these voices? Because I mean, Roberto mentioned that he was like a level of surprise that like, is this like a new thing? And that was kind of my reaction too. It was like, I know that there's specific instances that I can point through throughout my time at Breck when like these issues have like popped up, and you know, like I've heard about them from friends, or maybe the school has addressed them in some vague manner. But to see this like level and this kind of like continued these continued issues for students throughout their entire experience at Breck over a 20-year period, that like really showed that like there's a lot of stuff that like, you know, I'm not aware of. And you know, Robert, I was surprised when you said you were surprised, because I was thinking that maybe as a Black student you might be more aware of it, but to hear you that you had a level of surprise too also kind of like made me wonder what could be done to make sure that this is something that like the school talks about and the students know about, and hopefully it can be addressed better.
Well, one thing I want to address is I don't want to say I want to like use my words more clearly. It didn't like surprise me in the sense that like it was surprising seeing all this happen. I think it surprised me like when I talked about like me like as an upper school student, like you become more aware, you become more like you understand your identity more, and like with that comes a sort of level of awareness of how your identity fits into this institution that is Breck, you know? And so you start seeing a lot more little stuff. Like, I think one thing is that like I can talk about this is like, when you're a lower school, middle schooler, you know something's off when little stuff happens, you know something's off, but like you kind of, it becomes normalized for you, you know? Like, for example, this is like a personal example is, as like I was kind of like making more friends in middle school, like being African, being Ethiopian, like I started to get a lot of jokes, you know, a lot of jokes here and there. And like one constant one was always like, Ethiopians don't have food, you know, they're not eating anything. They don't have food in their country and they're always starving. And so like, as a middle schooler, I knew it was like a joke, but it still felt wrong. But like, I never like got to a point to address it. It kind of like became really normalized. And like, and then as I'm like coming into my identity more as a high school student, and like, I'm still getting these jokes and I'm starting to realize, nah, this is wrong. And the issue then becomes like, you've tolerated this up to now. Like, how do you go about addressing it when your friends see it as normal? Your white friends will joke about it. And like, you're starting to realize like, that's not right, you know? And so eventually like, it came to a point where like, I was like, stop. It's like, I don't mess with that anymore. And then it's like this, I don't know if y'all were there, but it was in the glass balcony. And I'm like, next person that says it is going to get slapped. They said it, they got slapped. So, you know, it's like, it's hard to like really like do anything about it because a lot of the little stuff becomes normalized, and growing into your identity, you become more aware. And so I think for me, I was surprised in the sense that like I was learning what was right and what was wrong, you know. And realize there's a lot more wrong than you bargain for when you're a lower schooler / middle schooler. But yeah.
I was talking with Louisa about this because like I do identify as a person of color, but I have a lot of privilege being biracial and being white passing. And so I think like we are talking about not being taught to identify microaggressions and just how damaging that is, of not even realizing when it's happening to other people, when it's happening to you, if you're not taught to identify them. And I think that's a really like substantial thing that Breck could start doing, as they have such a, they pride themselves in BAM and a strong like anti-bullying program, but I feel like I was never really taught. And I only went to middle school for 1 year, so I don't know much about the program, but not knowing how to identify microaggressions and to call them out, because they are micro and it does feel uncomfortable to call someone out when it doesn't seem like, oh, they meant it as a joke, or maybe they didn't really know what they were saying. But those things can take a toll on a person, especially if you're not really aware of them and how it affects like your own identity and how you see yourself if you're kind of internalizing what people are saying.
I think that's interesting. And I think part of Breck, what they do is it's kind of like the administration is sitting on like an ivory tower and like sending down these messages of like, be a Mustang, or like we're a community, we're focused on community, but it's just words at that point. Like when do you come down and like be on the ground with students? And I think part of Mr. Slack's impact was that that's exactly what he did. People like him, they were actually talking to people about like what's going on. Like they're not just calling a town hall and giving vague terms, they're actually like addressing things. I think that's really what needs to change, is like more action and less words. I feel like that's a huge theme, not only in this Black at Breck account, but in countless conversations about race at the school.
For sure. And I think we're talking about the administration, like we're talking about like people like high up, like the directors, the deans and stuff. But like Dylan said, like one way for them to be on the ground is like extend their, that's literally teachers, they interact with students daily. And the issue is those teachers a lot of teachers don't recognize like the power they have. Like, especially like if we're talking about like those lower school and middle school stories, it's like those teachers can make an impact. If they call out something that's not right, like you can like then dissuade someone from doing that same thing in the future. And it's like, it's this thing where those teachers, I understand they want to like, they're dealing with kids, so they want to give kids leeway for mistakes and stuff. But when you want to maintain this perfect picture, and instead of doing anything about something that's wrong, you brush it under the rug and hope that like nobody noticed anything happen, it then creates like a snowball for the future, And so I think like teachers, like Dylan said, Mr. Slack is a great example of someone who is always using his power, his voice, to distinguish right and wrong. Is teachers need to do that more for sure,
I really like that point. I forget who it was, but somebody I was talking to was talking about like the effect of like what is the importance of having somebody like quote unquote like in a position of power. And I think like Mr. Slack had a lot more of an impact on the community than Dr. Hernandez has ever had, even though she's in like the highest power of authority. So I think, Robert, you bringing like teachers into this mix, like I think that that's incredibly important, because they are, like you said, like on the ground, and they're there, when the situations happen. And I think kind of having more training for the teachers on how to, how do you handle when like a lower school student gets in trouble for, maybe like if one of them was, when I was in lower school, white kids would call me like ghetto and stuff. And I think like as a teacher, how do you explain to the white students that that's not okay, and kind of like get into the deeper meaning of why that's not okay versus just like that's not okay? Because I think like if you have people, if you assume that you need people in positions of power for there to be change, I think that ignores the fact and the impact that, or that ignores the impact that teachers can have on the student body. And I think because, you know, I look up to my teachers a lot more than I look to Dr. Hernandez or Dr. Taylor. I think that the change, I think, should start really with like the teachers. Kind of like I don't know. It's difficult to say it should start with teachers. I think there needs to be change throughout the entire institution, but I think focus on the teachers is what's really important.
So do you think teachers are then more responsible for the culture than like administrators are for the institution?
I think if it could be, I mean, like it's hard for me to comment on this because like I really didn't see a lot of this, and I didn't experience any of this. So I think for me to be able to comment like where the change needs to happen, that's really difficult for me because like, you know, going through it, like this is a lot of stuff that like I just wasn't tracking. And I think to answer that question, I would need to like be more knowledgeable and like have more experience with it. But I think teachers are responsible, you know, should be definitely like held accountable, or should be kind of like trained on how to deal with, you know, a situation in lower, middle, or even upper school when like, you know, something like that is happening, and how to like talk to students and kind of have a dialogue around like why that's not okay. Because I think for a lot of students, you know, especially white students, they don't know why it's not okay, or they don't really understand that that's having more, like a lot more of a kind of impact on like that person's identity than they realize. Because so often, you know, like as a white person, somebody can make fun of my identity and like it doesn't really faze me. But so then I think I might assume, or other white people might assume, that if I do the same thing on somebody's identity, that, you know, it phases them just as little as it might phase me. But that's really not the case, and it can have like these years of extended like trauma and just like sadness from having to like endure that from a young age.
John, I think like this concept that you're talking about is kind of like this. I think you want the change to start from the administration, but then trickle down into the teachers. And how I'm looking at this and is like, as a school, we have this saying, perpetually learning. I think if the administration is looking at this institution, and we have teachers that have been here doing tenure, like 40-year tenure or 30-year tenure, I think there's also like this sense of like complacency that administration's role is to make sure that this complacency and like their teaching styles gets nipped in the bud. And it's like, especially around racial issues, because this racial topic is something that's progressive and is continually changing, and it's up to the teachers to continually educate themselves with the proper methods or the proper ways to I don't even want to call them proper, but I want to call them like the most impactful ways to reach their students. I'd say some of the recent things that have been going on, like the MLK book reading that we do with our first grade buddies and the whole school participates in. That's something that over like the last 2 years, well, it's something it's relatively new, but like the process of kind of trying to continually refine it. So we are reaching these kids. We're trying to be able to have better conversations about why this is important, and not just brushing over that this is just about MLK. This is about Black history, and it's about this movement that really hasn't gone away and hasn't really, well, it has set the stage. It hasn't progressed in this change that we need. And I just wanted to add that to like your statement. I think like I believe you're 100% correct. Yes, teachers do influence the culture, but it's the administrators that then have that power to influence the teachers, who then influence the students, and how the culture of the school is better prepared for situations like this. And
How'd you guys feel about that MLK book reading though?
It felt very like cheesy and like surface level. I fully expected to see, you know, photographers going around taking pictures. That was kind of my impression, but I'm curious if you guys, I think the intention of like having more of a dialogue with the lower school students was good, but it just kind of seemed a little forced. I don't know. What do you guys think?
My perspective is like a little bit behind the scenes, but the reason why I believe it is forced was it's the pushback from the teachers to like have the discussions, or them not really educating themselves to have this or contributing to a way to have a better conversation with lower schoolers.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a problem that relies. It's the best we can do as students, but it's the teachers, the lower school teachers, who are planning how to have these conversations. And it's a lot of pressure if it's just one voice that is trying to push the conversation while the rest of the voices are just going along with it. It needs to be multiple different types of teachers, or multiple teachers pushing to have this conversation instead of one.
Yeah, and it's also like Derek said, I feel like I honestly enjoyed it because with my buddy, like it was more than a book. Like we talked about it, like a lot of different things, and like I was deliberate and like, I don't know, I feel like educating him on stuff that wasn't necessarily said in the book. I really didn't like the book choice, I will say that. And like I was kind of on like part of the planning committee behind the book, and like we kind of voiced that, but it had already been ordered at that point. So like we couldn't do anything about it. But like there was some kids who like literally just flipped through the book, did the activity and were done with like 20 minutes to go with their buddies. And I felt like that's unproductive, like if you're just reading the book and you're not willing, like going to have a conversation with the kid, like that in itself is just, like you said, it's kind of is a headpiece. It's just a picture token type of event thing. But I think like if you are deliberate, then it was like impactful for me. I really enjoyed it, and my buddy, I think he enjoyed it too. And I will say, like Derek said, like for first graders, like a lot of the pushback was teachers didn't want certain things like read. Like the book we read last year, y'all remember there were little post-it notes over certain words like killed, bombed. They didn't want the first graders like knowing that. And like that's also like if you're censoring and you're not telling the full truth, there's an issue with that, I feel like. And a part of that was from the first grade teachers who didn't want their kids being exposed to like these type of topics, which in reality is what they need to be taught and they need to learn. So there's a problem with that too, I feel like.
One question I have is for Wheezy. So now you've seen like more than one environment, like you're at Pomona now. How does their administration handle incidents versus what you experienced at Breck?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's obviously very different being just a college too, of how they handle things. I think that when you're at such a I go to a small institution for college too, and I think you're able to have more of the community's voices. That was something that was important to me when going to a college, is I wanted to feel like I knew people on my campus and things like that. I think there's like a lot of issues too. We do have a Black female president of our college, so I think just having like the way she handled the George Floyd murder, obviously we weren't on campus, but sending out things, trying to educate the community, things like that. It's hard to say because I had such an inside look into Breck and the way that you see things run. It's kind of very different when you go to college, if you realize you don't get to see as much of how things are going. And I think that's why it's crucial to like have this voice to change Breck, because I actually feel like it's something you can make a difference in and you can change. And I think that was my senior year of being I was senior class president, so I was close to people. And I remember after like the person calling Mr. Slack the N-word, I was in the offices. Like there was one day where definitely just wanted to kick me out because I spent like the entire day like between every class, and I was like, you need to do something more, like all of these things. And I remember during Mr. Taylor's town hall, he asked me to stand in the freshman hallway, actually, and was like, I want you to stand up there with them so that they know this is like a serious incident. I didn't know what the town hall, I mean, I assumed it was addressing this. And I remember me and Louisa were asked to stand up there, and I was just horrified when the specific incident wasn't addressed, because everyone in the entire school knew what he was talking about. And I think going around it just kind of showed more respect to the person who said it than it did to every other person who was feeling the pain and disrespect. And I think setting that aside for Breck, I think it's definitely a different feeling in college. There's a lot more, I'm not as involved in the like government or anything like that, but I think you have a feeling more that the students have a voice. And I feel like what I hear is from students, and from like during Corona and during everything getting sent home, it was student-led GoFundMe's. We had like the Black Affinity group was sending out emails and sending out things to the whole student body. And I think like Breck seems very, like you were saying, it's trickled down from administration to teachers. You're feeling it from people, from adults, whereas I feel like in a college setting, it's a lot more from your peers. And I feel like you get a lot more from your peers. And I think that's something that Breck can utilize more, is having more peer-led discussions, because we're smart individuals and people can be leading these things. And frankly, I think they're better equipped than a lot of teachers who are talking from the outside, who don't necessarily have personal experience. And I think that's something that Slack brought, is that he was a teacher who understood and a teacher who had heard from students, but I don't think Breck does enough of student-led things. I don't know if that answered it at all.
No, yeah.
I'm curious.
Part of me is like, no, you go.
No.
Okay.
All right, I'll go.
Part of me is just like pessimistic. Pessimistic just because I feel like this type of shit doesn't really go away. If anything, it'll increase once we go into college and the workforce and all these other places. Not that should deter anyone from any change or any reform, but it's like damn, this is only the beginning type of thing. You know what I mean?
I think you, not to like be like, yeah, be pessimistic, but I think you realize you have a lot less control. You have a lot less say. Like you kind of are thrown into an environment, and that could just be going from a senior to a freshman also, but you kind of realize you're entering into an environment where there's a lot more people who have a lot more say, and it's also, and a lot more of it is like is under the radar, and you're not even going to be aware of it necessarily, and I think that's disheartening.
Yeah, I do got a question for you, Weezy. Like, this is something like I've kind of discussed with other people about how, like you were saying, like you feel things need to be more peer-led at Breck. And so like when I like think of that, I think of like student government. I think of like student integrity council, where they're kind of like sort of buffers between the students and the administration. But like even like when I consider those, like it feels like they always like, when I hear what like goes on, and like I was like on student council in 9th grade, it feels like those positions are more just like they're just for show. Like I feel like nothing ever really gets done. So do you feel like that's also an issue? Because I know like student integrity council, like they get a say in like a student's punishment if they're caught cheating. But like I've talked to people who are on there, and they've said like, yeah, like we kind of get a say, but like it's rarely considered. Like it's just a recommendation. And so how do you feel like that is? Do you feel like that's part of the issue, where there's no real like substantial like buffer between the administration and the students, and they can kind of just do whatever?
Yeah. So I was on student government or whatever for 4 years, and I definitely think that it's not very effective, just to be honest. I just don't think it's an effective form. And I think part of that is because you can't, if you don't have like administration helping you or giving you any leeway or any kind of letting you take anything, everything was stop and checked point by like 10 people. And the reality is you're not going to get anything done if, 5 people have to check off on it and one person finds a problem with it and you're back to square one. And I think when I say student run things, I think it's a lot more, it is through, I think student government would be a good start. I think that not necessarily that those people are always the best to be having these conversations, or even that administration isn't always the most willing to foster these environments, or just teachers in general. Like my senior year, I watched The Hate U Give, and I remember I emailed Slack at like 2 a.m. and I was like, we need to do a showing of this at Breck. Like the white high school is exactly like Breck. Like we need to do something like this for Breck. And I emailed I set up meetings, and they wouldn't show it. They were like, we don't have time in the schedule. And I was like, okay, like I don't really understand how we can't find 2 hours to show a film that I feel like would be good, but that's fine. So I went to people, I tried to figure out how we could do this. I ended up doing it after school. I had Slack help me, and I went to, like, I emailed a bunch of English teachers, and I was like, I want to do this showing, and I want, can you offer extra credit so that students may come? I know that students probably aren't going to be super inclined to spend their free time coming back to school. So like, they're second semester seniors, can you give them some English extra credit so that they'll come? And I remember one teacher called it grade inflation and was like, I'm not going to do that. And just the unwillingness to help out when I was trying to, get some more students to go to a film. I think that to have student run things, you need teachers' help and you need administration to help the students and to give them leeway and to give them resources too, to be able to lead. Because I frankly think, like, the conversation we had one non-person of color show up for the whole group, which at Breck is just, and it was a great discussion. It was a great conversation, but I wish that more white students had shown up and engaged in a conversation. And I think if I had help from teachers and help from administration, like, you could have had a better turnout and things like that. So I think although it is with students, and I think that's where a good and productive conversation comes from, you do need help from like the people who can give it to you. And that's where I found Breck was kind of unwilling.
I think that's a really interesting point, because as we talked about, like, Breck is this community. I think one thing that we lack as a community is like a willingness for other committees and other student-led organizations to step up to the plate when it's most needed. Like, you as an individual, yes, we're very motivated and driven to get this done. We scheduled all these meetings and set this up and got it done. But this is something that we do have clubs and committees for, but you need those leaders to also be involved. Like, we talk about this all the time when we talk about student government. Like, it feels like it's a popularity contest between who's going to get the vote and who's going to like run the school, essentially. And sometimes we get good leaders and sometimes you don't. And what we need, though, regardless of what, if it's self-interest or if it's self-fulfilling for these to get these positions, it's still a requirement for these students. We still need like this faculty. I guess I'm torn between, we have these student organizations, but the students in the organizations, again, get complacent or get caught up with the title rather than actually the impact that they can have with this organization. And looking at it from like a one-dimensional stance, when they can look at it from a three-dimensional stance. And I think that example that you gave just shows that there's ways where we have clubs, whether it's a service club, whether it is a student diversity club, that will get people to go see these, to get people to attend filmings and showings like that, and then have discussions about them because that's what their purpose is supposed to be. Yet it's that time, oh, I don't want to be at school that late. And then it's like, okay, well then why are you on this club? This is 2 hours to a good discussion, and it can lead in for the rest of the week, and it's supposed to be impactful. It's not just hearsay. It's not just something that we can to fill your time. Like, this is something that we think will enrich your experience at the school. And that's the one thing that where I believe student organizations can step up. Having gone through student council, having gone through student diversity and inclusion, it's finding different ways to be creative and engaging the student voice and still having that interconnectedness as students and student organizations. I think sometimes they operate in bubbles by themselves and are only connected by faculty members who are stretching themselves too thin. So thank you for that example.
That's really disheartening to hear, honestly, because I think it kind of really highlights how Breck views, if we're talking about just race in general and issues that come up with people's racial identities. And it feels like the administration is always more reactive than proactive, you know? For us, we've been sitting here for an hour discussing ways the administration could better respond to events, where we shouldn't even be focused on that. If we should be more focused on maybe Wheezy, going to show a film that really illustrates these issues and in educating people, you know what I mean? And it's disheartening to hear that, because it's when Breck sends out an email talking about, we're going to be better in the future, we're going to look for ways to improve, and then there's ways for them to improve in their faces, they're like, nah, we don't have enough time in the school day. No, we got to be more focused on education, And that really shows to me how they view it. They only want to address issues when they come up. They don't want to take any time to educate people and prevent those issues. And I feel like that's part of the problem. And there's also a lack of accountability in the administration. We were talking about buffers, student government, student integrity council. Those should be kind of in a sense, they should hold the administration accountable, and because without them, the administration can do whatever they want without consequence. And as a result, when stuff like this builds up, you get things like the blackatbreck Instagram account, It's because there's constantly a lack of discussion, a lack of defining, and just a lack of addressing the issue. And that's the problem.
I wonder if the part of Breck's culture that's hyper achievement oriented and focused on outcomes in the classroom, on power school and colleges and stuff like that, almost contributes to the feeling that we don't have enough time to sit down and really discuss this type of stuff. You know what I mean? And I almost see that in myself, where in the past, if I had the choice to maybe go to a Race in America meeting or grind out a chem lab or something, I would always choose the assignment, just because that's where my priorities were, as strange as that sounds. But I just wonder if that part of Breck's culture may be interfering with our progress as a school.
I think it could also be the people that type of school attracts. With a school that's as expensive as Breck, you're going to attract very wealthy people. And I think with that comes a lot of very wealthy white students. And I think a lot of, speaking from my own perspective, growing up in mostly white neighborhoods with mostly white friends and family members and family friends and stuff. So coming from communities where there isn't as much dialogue around these issues, and it might bring in students Wheezy, I think when you brought up how there was only one non-POC that went to the showing of The Hate U Give, I think that just shows that there's a level of discomfort, but also a lack of urgency kind of with the feeling of how these issues need to be addressed from the white students at Breck. And I think I think Dylan, what you're touching on there is just the type of school Breck is. I think it'd be different if it was a public school and you get all these different types of kids going to school, but because it's so expensive, you will have a huge chunk of students kind of coming from the very like wealthy white side of the United States and Minnesota, that just kind of not contribute to it, but are just kind of growing up in a different world than a lot of the other students who aren't from that world. And so I think when you have a school that, is as successful at bracket placing students at like top universities and is marketing itself as like a college preparatory school, I think you're going to get those types of students there at a school like that. So I don't know if it's as much like the culture of the school. Like I don't know if it's like the chicken or the egg kind of with your question.
To address Dylan's question though, so this is kind of a different area, but so with the corona and getting sent home, Pomona, it was like a week after being sent home, decided that we were going to be universal pass, which means that you couldn't fail a class. If you got incomplete into the summer, you could finish it then. And then if you did fail, it went off your transcript. And this was in an attempt to prioritize what was happening over academics. And so that all students, because, we weren't at equal learning environments being sent home. And I think for me, that shows that an institution can make a change to show its priorities. And in that moment, it wasn't academics. And they knew that, we wouldn't have grades for our transcripts and that could potentially affect us for graduate school, but that it was more important to identify what was going on and the crisis that our students were going through, and that they shouldn't have to worry about grades. And I think that kind of shows me that a school does have that power, and Breck could make a choice to prioritize having conversations, taking time out of the day to do these things instead of solely focusing on education. And I do think that they've kind of instilled a priority of grades and of academic excellence at the cost often of addressing these other issues. And, the entire student body hasn't been kind of forced, except for MLK Day, maybe, to engage in conversations like this. And I think the school has the power to make a choice and to make this more of a priority. And I don't think they've done that. And now they have an opportunity to. So hopefully they can take this as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because John, I have a question for you because you kind of talked about like you've been talking about how like this whole account and like a lot of the stories that have been present on it, you were like surprised at them. Were you more surprised at the feelings that they caused and kind of the emotions that were a result and how they affected those individuals, or were you more surprised that like you're like, I didn't realize this happened?
It was a mix of a few things. I think one of them was like a mix of like, oh, like I didn't know that this was happening. I don't know if it was like a student from like 2005 writing that, or somebody from like the class of 2020. And so I think like it was just a level of surprise because like there were things that like I hear that I'm like, oh my gosh, like I totally remember that like happening, at some point, or like hearing about that at some point. And I never would have like considered that this is something that student would be like posting about, now, or is like still in their mind, because it wasn't in my mind. And I think it was also a surprise of like I've always known that minority students at Breck have like a different experience, but I think seeing a lot of students having this negative, like I knew that it was like, not that it was bad, but I knew that there was like something off about it, but seeing that it was like this off was also a level of surprise, I think at any institution or any school where there's like a majority ethnic group and a minority ethnic group, I think that the views and experiences of those two different types of students, and for all I know, I think that they might be different, but for all I know, that's just because I've only gone to Breck. So I've only gone to Breck. I don't know if it's like this at Laker SPA or Wayzata or North High School. Like, I don't know, what it's like, but I would assume that, whether it's in the US or it's in South America or, anywhere in the world, wherever there's a school where there's, a majority racial group, I'd imagine that the experiences would be different between students. So I think seeing it be like this bad was like a surprise to me. So I don't know if that was unique to Breck. I'm also curious too, do you guys have friends at Blake or SPA or other private schools or just like other schools in Minnesota that like have these shared experiences, or do you think that it's only at Breck?
It's actually interesting that you bring that up. Hold up, Barry, because there's a literally, I was looking today, and there's a Black at Blake account on Instagram too that was just made a couple days ago. So yeah, it's something that's kind of in line with being a minority group at a PWI. But to go back to my question, I think that's like kind of what Weezy was touching on, is the fact that like you being a white student and you being unaware of these type of things and how they impact them, that's like that's kind of crazy, you know, like especially considering the fact that you've been going to Breck your entire life and that you don't know about it. I think it says a lot about like the school's priorities, like, and the fact that you haven't been like really educated on this, you know, and that's part of the issue, I feel like.
One last thing that I'd like to add is this is something that I went to in my junior year, called the SDLC, which is like the Student Leadership Conference, or Student Diversity Leadership Conference. It's from a private, and it's like National Association of Independent Schools, and it's schools from all across the country. It brings students of color, students with different sexual orientations, religious affiliations, physical abilities, and it talks about what's important and what goes on with the school. And this is an issue that goes beyond Breck, and like Roberta touched on, is something that's beyond Minnesota, just Breck. Like this is a national issue that we see at independent schools, predominantly white independent schools, for high school students coming up from, it could be K through 12, feeling like they are alone, feeling like their voice is suppressed, or feeling like they don't have a teacher that they can relate to. One of the biggest things at this conference that they talked about is representation in faculty and administration is the best way, or one of the best ways that makes students feel comfortable, like they have a voice and have a place there. Because once you see the teachers, once you see a reflection of yourself in the teachers, then you feel like this is a place where you belong. And that's something that it isn't just Breck, but within our Breck bubble, we make it think that this is just a Breck incident. This is a situation that we see all across the country in many different private schools and public, predominantly white institutions.
Well, we've been going for, I think, about an hour now. Do people feel like, is there anything else that somebody would like to add before we finish the episode? All right. Well, I think I'd like to thank Weezy for being on the podcast again. I thought you added some really cool points and stuff, and we're happy to have you. And yeah, if you guys enjoyed the episode and stuck around for this long, please email us any ideas or suggestions or complaints. Constructive criticism is always welcome. So thank you.